Everyone. No, I have to start off representing Topeka. I noticed the Topeka background wasn't up. It's so good to see everyone today. I'm going to go ahead and start with Tacoma while we're still letting people in. Welcome to the October 29th Governor's Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. Due to the distance, health, and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication, allowing members of the public without cost to listen using teleconference as available. The agenda for this meeting has been posted on the Public Square website and may be requested from the Office of the Governor by emailing Don Knutston at don.knutston@ks.gov. Each member of the commission and staff will state their name and title each time the individual begins speaking or voting so that the individual can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure the microphones, phones, or electronic devices are muted when the participants are speaking so the ability of remote listeners or observers to hear the proceedings is not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During the meeting, the commission will not recess to a closed or executive session pursuant to KSA 754319. Each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee and the chairperson will announce the results of the final vote. At this time, this is Dr. Anderson, Superintendent of Topeka Public Schools and co-chair, and I'll turn it over to co-chair Dr. Portillo to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. This is Shannon Portillo, co-chair the commission, and we are incredibly grateful to Ms. Maska from the Governor's Grants Office for speaking with us today. She'll do a short presentation on the role of the Governor's Grants Office and then be open to questions and answers. So we'll turn it over to you, Ms. Maska. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll get started here. I'm Jolene Maska, Administrator for the Kansas Governor's Grants Program, and pleased to be with you this afternoon to talk a little bit about our program. The Kansas Governor's Grants Program values Kansans living in healthy communities where they can grow, learn, feel safe, and thrive. The program provides training opportunities, including the annual Governor and Attorney General's Crime Victims' Rights Conference and the Kansas Academy for Victim Assistance, committed to the improvement of crime victim services by enhancing the skills of professionals working with crime victims and survivors. In addition, we staff the Governor's Advisory Council on Domestic and Sexual Violence Response, a collaborative effort with the Kansas Office of the Attorney General, the Kansas Supreme Court Office of Judicial Administration, Department of Corrections, the Kansas Law Enforcement Training Center, and the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. In addition, we administer 15 federal formula grant programs and 2 state grants and 1 federal discretionary grant program. Our program is dedicated to creating a safe Kansas. Services are available and accessible in every community. Accountability for systems, agencies, and services. Funding is provided for adequate resources, and empowering communities to help individuals and agencies succeed. I'd like to share with you just briefly the different grant programs we have and just a description of how those are used in our communities throughout the state. And so we believe that investing today, thriving tomorrow with our federal programs. The Sexual Assault Services Grant Program provides funding for intervention and support services for adults, youth, child victims of sexual assault and their family members. The Federal Services Training Officers, Prosecutors, Violence Against Women program supports communities in their efforts to develop and strengthen effective law enforcement and prosecution strategies and victim services in cases involving violent crimes against women. The Improving Criminal Justice Responses to Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking discretionary grant is used to enhance a comprehensive criminal justice system's response to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking that holds the offender accountable for their action and protects the privacy and safety of victims. This grant supports the work of the advisory council I just mentioned. The Victims of Crime Act Victim Assistance Grant supports services to crime victims who have suffered physical, sexual, financial, or emotional harm as a result of the commission of a crime. Direct services are efforts that respond to their emotional and physical needs, assist them to stabilize their lives after victimization, to help them understand and participate in the criminal justice system, and to restore a measure of safety for the victim. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services provides formula grants to us that we administer. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act is a formula grant that we distribute to the 20 domestic violence programs accredited by the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence across Kansas, and we use a formula to distribute those funds to those programs. And they address domestic violence and dating violence, providing shelter, support services for victims and their dependents, and for children exposed to domestic violence. We also received CARES Act money this year to enhance that particular grant program in the preventing, preparing for, and responding to the coronavirus public health emergency. In addition, we received State Access and Visitation Grant, and this funds supervised child exchange or supervised child visitation to children and families at risk because of circumstances relating to neglect, substance abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, domestic or family violence. We have two grants that we use for that come from state general fund money. The first one is for sexual and domestic violence programs across Kansas, and these funds enhance and expand services in underserved areas and underserved populations to assist victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Some of these funds also are provided to the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence for training and technical assistance of programs. And this money is also used as a cash for any matching requirements of federal grant programs. Children's Advocacy Centers also receive state general fund money. These funds are used to enhance child advocacy centers that coordinate investigation and intervention services for abused children and multidisciplinary approach model. The Office of Justice Programs, Bureau of Justice Assistance, we have numerous grants through that federal department. I won't talk about, or I'll talk about in a little bit about the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant, but just want to go quickly through these other ones. The Bulletproof Vest Partnership Program, funds are used towards the purchase of an approved vest, at least 50% of the cost. The John R. Justice Student Loan Repayment Grant provides student loan repayment assistance for full-time local, state, and federal government public defenders and full-time local and state government prosecutors who are committed to serving in these roles for at least 3 years. The Prison Rape Elimination Act Formula Grant Program assists Kansas Department of Corrections in preventing, detecting, and responding to prison rape in order to protect individuals of sexual abuse and sexual harassment while confined in prison. Project Safe Neighborhoods Formula Grant Program. The Kansas U.S. Attorney's Office has oversight of the grant program, and our program provides the administrative and financial functions for the U.S. Attorney. These funds are used to create and foster safe neighborhoods through a sustained reduction in violent crime and addressing criminal gangs. The residential substance abuse treatment for state prisoners is money that we award to the Kansas Department of Corrections for implementing a residential substance abuse treatment program at the correctional facility for those incarcerated for a period of time sufficient enough to complete a substance abuse treatment. The Criminal History Improvement Grant is a program we award to the KBI to continue the U.S. Department of Justice efforts to build an accurate and useful national system of criminal records. The Paul Coverdale National Forensic Sciences Improvement Act is awarded to the 3 major forensic laboratories in Kansas at the KBI in Sedgwick County and Johnson County to improve the quality, timeliness, and credibility of forensic science services for criminal justice purposes. In addition, through the CARES Act, we were able to receive funding to support state and local jurisdictions in preparing for, and responding to efforts related to the coronavirus in Kansas. So currently, we do not have very many law enforcement agencies receiving our grant funds. The Federal Stop Violence Against Women Act, there are 5 agencies, our Victims of Crime Act 6, and I'll talk now about the Burn JAG grant, and we have 11. The largest federal grant for law enforcement purposes is the JAG program, and this program is to assist state and local units of government and tribes in supporting a broad range of activities to prevent and control crime based on state, local, and tribal needs and conditions. The Kansas Criminal Justice Coordinating Council has the statutory oversight of the program, and we administer the program as designated by the governor. And just to give you an idea of how much our state receives in this JAG award, in federal fiscal year 2020, $1,817,630, and federal fiscal year 2019, $1,940,933, in federal year 2018, $1,926,777. The JAG program has several requirements or purpose areas that funding can be used for. While we're flexible on what these funding program areas are, and an applicant can determine that as they write their application, the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council actually prepares and identifies the solicitation and the priorities for the year of how they want to use these funds across the state. They're also responsible for making the final awards for this particular grant. Those purpose areas are for law enforcement, prosecution, and court programs, as well as indigent defense, prevention and education programs, corrections, community corrections, drug treatment and enforcement, technology improvement, crime victims and witness programs, and mental health programs, and behavioral programs and crisis intervention teams. So I wanted to share with you just some of the requirements that law enforcement agencies are required now to have if they are to receive funding from this particular grant program. Criminal history record information. The law enforcement agency must verify if it's meeting the statutory requirements for submission of criminal offense and criminal history data to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Before an application is reviewed, we do confirm with the KBI that agency is submitting that particular data. Applicants whose grant projects generating any court disposition or other records must ensure those records are made available to state repositories if they are relevant to national instant criminal background check system determinations. If funding's available or given to emergency communications activities, they must comply with the current SAFECOM guidance and support the statewide communication interoperability plan, as well as the coordinator for the statewide interoperability. Any DNA testing of evidentiary materials must ensure that eligible DNA profiles are uploaded to the combined DNA index system by a government DNA lab with access to CODIS, and no profiles generated with JAG funding may be entered into any other type of non-governmental DNA database without express approval. And then all training received by law enforcement officers on the use of force, racial and ethnic bias, de-escalation of conflict, and constructive engagement with the public must be reported quarterly by law enforcement JAG recipients to our office. I just want to comment a little bit about requirements. I've been with the grants program since Governor Kelly took office, and then before that, when Governor Sebelius was in office and she moved the JAG program under her office to administer, I was there for 8 years. And then for the past 8 years prior to Governor Kelly's administration, it was administered by someone else. But what I want to point out, in that 8-year gap, when I left, we had like 35 requirements within our grant assurances for law enforcement agencies to meet. Now we have 50. And the state has to ensure federal requirements of more than 68 for us to be in compliance. And so it always reminds me of our attorney when she trains on grant assurances. She always comments that 90% are federal requirements and not from the state. So I think for law enforcement departments across the state, particularly the smaller, medium-sized and smaller ones, these requirements are really challenging for them to meet when you see them all. One of the other requirements is in custody death reporting, and the requirement that we have to report it to the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and our inability to actually retrieve that data. While the KBI is waiting on updating its Kansas incident-based reporting system, they're seeing that to be the summer of 2021. And hopefully they'll be able to include deaths of individuals in custody at local jails. We do receive information from Department of Corrections regarding inmate deaths. One of the requirements of in-custody deaths now that we need to report is those deaths that are health-related, as well as any other type of death, but health-related or criminal-related while they're incarcerated. So beginning in 2017, BJA required certain recipients of JAG funds to meet a requirement specific to citizenship and immigration status. And they were required to fill out a form by BJA that we had to submit should they receive funds, that they meet these federal qualifications, and certifying that they don't have any conflict in providing this information and working with the federal immigration departments. And then in 2019, that response changed, and now they have to submit on agency letterhead if the applicant is a state or local government, and upload that attachment with their application. And if there's any conflict with any laws, for them to communicate with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security or Immigration, or if their jurisdiction has anything preventing them from doing that. And then they have to upload that information to ensure that they will comply with it. The National Criminal Justice Association, NCJA, was formed in 1971 and promotes the development of justice systems in states, tribal nations, and units of local government to enhance public safety and shape and implement criminal justice policy. And I believe Kate sent out kind of prepared description of these two congressional bills that was developed by NCJA. And so the National Criminal Justice Association predicts, given the short time frame to incorporate these proposed changes in law enforcement standards, the cost of compliance and the accumulating penalties, it is likely that most states and localities, no matter how determined to adopt the bill reforms, will forfeit most, if not all, of their JAG award in the first year, and many will be unable to comply for many more years. If either bill becomes law, Kansas may never be able to fully comply with the mandates that could result in the loss of JAG funding, because some localities simply will be unable or unwilling to make the extensive required changes. And I think you all know those challenges ahead of you as you're looking at these issues within your commission requirements and asked by the governor. According to NCJA, many in Congress are strongly opposed at this particular time to provide any additional federal funds to law enforcement agencies. While I don't believe these two bills will be heard by the current Congress, I have no idea and haven't heard from NCJA if the new Congress will take these two bills up or if something else will occur. So just wanted you to be aware that potential of additional penalties on JAG funding. So in closing, I just wanted to share with you, we're currently developing an implementation plan for our 4 federal grant programs providing funds for services to crime victims and survivors. And we've gathered data through needs assessment, focus groups, key informant interviews, and victim survivor surveys. As we gather data, we ask questions of the different respondents regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion in direct provision of services to crime victims. And by diversity, we explained they were people of various genders, religions, nationalities, cultures, ethnic backgrounds, and races. And so it's our intent to actually pull all that data together. We're working on it now and have a final report by the end of the year. So I am open for questions. Let's see if I can video on.
This is Dr. Anderson, the co-chair. First of all, thank you for your report. At this time, as we open this up to the rest of our commissioners, I always ask, and I'll certainly be asking it at the end, if you would like to share 1 or 2 things that as we present our report, recommendations that you'd like to make sure that we do include from what you've just shared. Please do state that so that we're very clear about what you're hoping we are recommending to the governor as it relates to some of the challenges that you just mentioned in your presentation. And if you have that on the top of your mind now and want to share that, great. And then I'll turn it over to the rest of the commissioners.
Well, I think you all have heard, and I've listened to some of your meetings from the challenges of law enforcement adhering to so many different requirements, and how can we help them meet those requirements. And so I think it can be done. It's just developing a plan to be able, if we're going to add penalties to our different grant programs, then let's ensure that we can help them succeed to meet the requirements and recommendations from this committee or from the federal government. Instead of just penalizing and saying, no, you can't have any money, just go about and do what you're going to do anyway. And so how do we do that? And I'm not sure I had that answer yet, but it takes a lot of technical assistance and really working with communities.
This is Shannon Portillo, co-chair. I was going to follow up with what are the specifics that we could do to help some of those organizations, but You just mentioned that you may not have the answer either. One of our learning sessions, we heard about some new legislation in California that actually created a statewide data collection system for law enforcement agencies, where smaller agencies who may have trouble with some of this could actually just enter their information through a web portal that's managed by the state. Is there any kind of centralized data collection that you think might be helpful, or what are some of those biggest hurdles when it comes to agencies reporting on some of their required information?
It's who they report to and how easy it is to report it. Some of these police departments are so small, there's just a handful of people that work there. And so when we require some new database or a grant portal, how simple is it to enter that data and provide it, whether it goes through the Kansas Bureau of Investigation or to the Kansas Sentencing Commission or wherever that information is needed. It's always a challenge for the smaller rural departments.
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. So as we think about specifics, so that we leave here with some next steps, while we may want to avoid penalizing, perhaps awarding has been one of the discussions, perhaps through grants. So for example, the state awards schools that want to do redesign as a redesign grant. So as we are talking about everything from bilingual officers or individuals being trained in certain spaces, would you have a suggestion related to creating some innovative kinds of funding streams, grant perhaps specific, to encourage the kinds of behaviors that we have been discussing here that we want to encourage?
Absolutely. I think that would be extremely important if we could have a person or a dedicated team that could really help enhance those types of services to local departments and how they can generate it within their communities, whether it be through finding federal dollars. There's lots of federal grant fundings out there, but many of these agencies don't know how to go about it or fill out an application. And because there's so many different requirements at that federal level. One of the things we want to be able to do, and we hired a person just within this last year, is really work with communities to enhance and develop their grant writing and development within the community. And we're not there yet, but we'll be there. But I think a dedicated person to assist law enforcement in particular around training and looking at those services directly within their communities would be beneficial.
This is Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. A lot of the times when they talk about data collection, they always bring up when I think is something about the rurality of Kansas, about the small police departments that have trouble complying with data collection. My question would be, is there any grants or could you see possibly making grants available that would encourage those 5, 6, 7 person police departments to consolidate into a sheriff's office that would have the resources to comply? Because it seems inefficient to have cities with 4 or 5 police officers when they could have a larger body sheriff's department policing the entire area, which would take a lot of the burden off of those smaller places, and it would also give them more resources in order to comply with data collection.
That's an excellent idea. I'm not sure of federal funding off the top of my head to do that. It might be a local jurisdictional issue. And I'm not sure if any statute changes would need to apply to be able to do that, or if it's just local. But that makes a lot of sense.
This is Jackson Winsett with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. are the policies and practices that the funding is to be used for, is it ever evaluated maybe at the end of the year at a given time post after the funding has been awarded and used? Is it ever evaluated to see if whatever that police station or whomever is receiving the funding, whatever they say they need it for, it's being used for that?
Mostly outcome data is what we have developed. We haven't gone in and done any extensive type of evaluations. I will tell you, the majority of our law enforcement grants are around equipment or officer overtime, and what their just day-to-day needs are, more than developing programs. Although we do have some with our Violence Against Women Act and our Victims of Crime Act of working with crime victims. But for those other agencies, it's usually something they need to purchase.
Okay.
This is Mark McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas. Thank you for your presentation. It was very thorough. I did notice in your presentation that you were making grants to prosecutions, prevention, things like that. Does your office also make grants to public defenders' offices as well?
They can apply for, I think, I'm trying to think of, they can. I can get back to you on which specific grants, but they can. We can award public defenders some funding.
Thank you.
This is Shannon.
This is John Nave.
We're just going to take a couple of last questions. So Mr. Nave, and then if anyone has a last question, we'll wrap up. So
this is John Nave, the Kansas AFL-CIO. My question is, what percentage is there a percentage that is left out there on the table where agencies across the state are not applying? Is there a percentage like, 15% to 70%, or, that is left on the table that these agencies across the state are not applying for these grants?
We try to award all of the money that we have out. Now, what happens is they don't apply. So certainly if you look at that middle section of Kansas, you take that Salina Highway, is that 81? So east of there, they're applying. West of there, not so much. Southeast, southwest, you know the story. It's the bigger departments, the medium-sized department know how to pull these applications together and apply. And that's what we want to try to change by having somebody dedicated to actually go out into the community and really work with trying to have more diversity across the state and sharing these funds. Because if you look at the history, our history since 2003, you will see the same agencies over and over.
Thank you again, Ms. Maska, for your, as was stated, very detailed and thorough report. We so appreciate your investment in time this evening. As we prepare to move on to the next item, if you have other questions that weren't asked, please do send those to Ms. Davis and we will forward those along. We've quite the agenda this evening as we continue. This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair and superintendent of Topeka Public Schools. The next item on our agenda is includes housekeeping items and timeline. On that timeline, the 19th of November, we had that down as a potential day to meet. And so we wanted to get the feel of the commission. We would recommend that we maintain that November the 19th. We shared we would talk about that closer to that date. And unless anyone objects, that November the 19th is still on the calendar. Does that sound okay for everyone? All right, not seeing any objection to that. The rest of the agenda includes going over our report. So if you remember, we did not go through the listening sessions the last meeting. Therefore, when we conclude this portion, I'll be turning it over to Dr. Portillo, who will facilitate the remainder of the meeting for the commission. So for now, we're going to start off with our report. And then if you had a listening session you attended the last time that you didn't report out on, this evening is a great time to do that. And then all the other listening sessions in the last 2 weeks, we'd love to hear any recommendations from that. We're going to go ahead and pull up the report in its draft form and see if we can come to consensus on some of the new items that we discussed previously. As Dr. Portilla and I kind of share this piece of going through this report, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Portilla regarding the items that we know are in green that perhaps we can agree on, and then we'll go through other items that we can determine if we can move over to green.
So for our green items, these were all of the things that we have previously discussed and had come to mostly an agreement on. These were all previously voted on. Were there any pieces that any commissioners wanted to discuss in the green section before we move to the yellow section where we have open items for discussion? Okay, we will move on to the yellow section. These are the sections where we've had some listening sections since our last meetings, and we are ready to discuss these and hopefully move them from the yellow section to a green section so we can finish writing these out for the report. So we've had quite a few listening or learning sessions around law enforcement training, and we've started with 2 broad discussions. First, that KLETC should create standards for which training courses are acceptable in fulfillment of the 40 hours of training requirement per year. In KLETC.
Sorry to break in, Dr. Portillo. I didn't put this context in here, but this is a piece that had been, that Dr. Davis had volunteered to write some new language on. So this is the language that Dr. Davis provided on these 2 items.
Thank you for that additional context. I appreciate it. So Dr. Davis, would you like to walk us through the language that you provided here?
Yeah, that's fine. Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. So this first bubble essentially says that the Caltech has to create standards for which training courses are acceptable for fulfillment in the 40 hours. So right now, anything you do can go towards the 40 hours. We want Caltech, and what this would suggest, what this says that Caltech has to say, if you do a training on diversity, it has to include A, B, C, and D. If it doesn't include A, B, C, and D, then it can't count towards your 40 hours, if that makes sense. And it also do that by subject area, as I wrote in here, and those standards have to be updated yearly. So it's not like the standards that set the standards for what's acceptable every year. And also Caltech should include what is called active bystander for law enforcement. It means duty to intervene training should be included, and also critical intervention training should be included. The second bubble says that Caltech should create a supervisor training college. College is just a word I used. Essentially what this means that every law enforcement officer that is promoted to a supervisory position has to go to specialized training for that supervisory position. And so this is what we were talking about last time about that military style, how the military trains people to be supervisors. And so this training will be separate from the other training, and it will be specific as to the person's supervisory level. So the first level supervisors are sergeants. So there'll be a sergeant school where you learn to become from a regular police officer to a sergeant. There'll also be mid-level training for lieutenants, captains, majors. How the department is organized. There'll be a second set of training for those mid-level supervisors, and that training should focus on, the basic things like public administration, law, and society, but also management skills, leadership skills, and ethics. That's it.
So feedback around these 2 items.
This is Gordon Ramsay. I appreciate the work done on that. I think it really encapsulates pretty much what we discussed. The one thought I had after we had our listening session with KLETC was, rather than, and I see you covered it in here, require training equivalent to, really a lot of the best way to address the training that we want to have done is address the learning objectives versus the specific training, because training can, different types of training can come and go based on, schools, or based on and it can evolve. So I think the learning objectives are probably, it might be better to word the learning objectives rather than suggest specific training. But I do think I can live with this because you talk about the equivalent training too. Hopefully that makes sense what I just said.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Would it be possible to say training equivalent to or with similar learning objectives as, and then list the trainings out so we're very specific that it's the learning objectives that we're after?
I think that would be a good idea.
Other feedback or discussion? This is Dr. Portillo, Co-Chair again. I recognize the use of the word college is kind of used broadly here. I would suggest shifting that to training or something that doesn't imply academic credit, unless we are suggesting that these would be courses that would count towards academic credit. Since KLETC is part of KU, if we use the word college, college has a very specific meaning within that organizational structure. So I think that we might just want to replace the word college with training. Or supervisory academy. Academy may be a word that would be similar to college without the same connotation for the organization.
This is Brandon, University of Kansas. Yeah, it bothered me too, but I didn't know what else to put. So I'm not wed to that at all.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. It looks like someone suggested using the word program. Dr. Portillo, are you fine with that as a possibility?
Yes.
So replacing that with the word program with those few adjustments, are we fine with, do we have consensus that this can move on to green, and our next commissioners that presented language for tribal jurisdiction can proceed to talk a little bit about their language? Is there anyone that's uncomfortable with what Dr. Jordan has detailed out for us, moving to green? I'm sorry, Dr. Davis, and thank you so much for doing this particular piece. All right, not seeing anybody objecting to that. That moves over to green. The tribal jurisdiction area is for the next commissioners that presented that language, presuming that that was created by members of the commission.
I believe, was this Mr. Howell and Commissioner Towie who presented this language?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Howell, would you mind walking us through the language that you've presented here, please?
What we did was just added a little more text to provide some more background about tribal jurisdiction, and that it's multifaceted. You can't just define what tribal jurisdiction is. You have to teach multiple layers and multiple topics around it to get a full understanding of the tribal jurisdictional issues. And so that's what we did here, is we just added some more text to kind of round out the description of all the topics that are related to a better understanding of tribal jurisdictional issues. The other thing that we added to it too was a recommendation that that any changes for the coursework need to be in coordination and consultation with the Kansas tribes to be sure that their voices are heard when it comes to this type of training.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Is there any discussion or feedback on these two items? Do we have consensus to move these from the yellow to the green section? Any objections? Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Howell and Commissioner Talley.
And I believe this is Kate Davis from the governor's office. I believe that's the last of the kind of homework assignments that have been returned at this point. So we're back to just recommendations that the commission has discussed.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Ms. Davis. So the final items, although I believe we left data collection off for now, the certification and standards, if the commission is okay with the language of creating a statewide list of officers who've been fired or have use of force complaints. We previously said we still need to clarify who and what conditions and compliance related matters. Previously, we shared that. I don't know if the commission still would like that. The other item was requiring that officers have completed KLETC training before they are issued a firearm for the use of duty. Are those areas, at least certainly for the second one, that doesn't have any added homework, the requiring the officers having completed KLETC training before they are given a firearm for use in line of duty. Are we comfortable with that moving over to green?
This is Dr. Portillo, co-chair. I do just want to clarify that we did update this. So we added for use in line of duty to the end so that officers can still be issued their firearm to complete their training, since they will be training on the firearm issued by their agency, but they won't be able to use that in the line of duty until they've completed training at the Law Enforcement Training Academy.
This is Dr. Anderson, and since we do not see any objection to moving this to green, that one statement we will move to green as it appears there is consensus. We're going to go back to the other statement because it requires some potential needed clarification. Previously, we said we would like to create a statewide list of officers who've been fired or have use of force complaints. Do we still feel that that needs further clarifications regarding the conditions of the list? The reporting compliance, do we still feel that needs further clarification? Chief Ramsey, I see you have your mute off.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair. I think for me, the fired portion, a statewide list of officers who have been fired, is acceptable. Use of force complaints is, even unfounded complaints. I think it's vague, and I think if maybe related to criminal charges or sustained criminal charges would be a better way to do it. Otherwise, it really opens up the door that could be problematic as we go forward. I think we should be more specific on what we would like there.
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. I'm going to ask if Dr. Lewis is on here, if he, regarding the fired portion, since we're dealing with this first sentence. One, Chief Ramsey, your comment about force, use of force complaints, and adding the piece that perhaps that were problematic as stated. You can share what language you'd like to be added to that last little piece again. But in that same sentence, I believe we talked briefly about the fired piece. What if someone is fired because of something that was not egregious? Perhaps what if there was a discrimination type of complaint? And that just saying that someone was fired could potentially prevent officers from marginalized groups from getting jobs in other places, or officers in general. Dr. Lewis, would you like to speak to that if you were with us this evening? And if he's not available to speak to that directly, I think that may have come up in a previous discussion. Dr. Portillo, do you recall that being an area of concern as well, as we also add to the statement as Chief Ramsey has suggested?
This is Dr. Portillo. I do remember that piece of the conversation. And when we just say fired broadly, that can incorporate a lot of things that we may not have intended with this particular statement. Since we haven't clarified kind of the list of who or what conditions, I wonder if we might say that this should be something that CPOST could come up with a list of conditions that would that since they would be the organization that would be maintaining this list for the state, if we might ask them to consult with us on what would be a potential list of reasons for firing and how use of force complaints are substantiated. I think waiting all the way until there are criminal charges may be problematic, since there may be some bias against charging police officers criminally. And that's very discretionary based on prosecutors in communities. But we might consider how use of force complaints are considered by CPOST. So since CPOST would be maintaining this list, they may be a good group to consult with on how we define the list.
So Dr. Portillo, this is, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Commissioner Winsett.
Jackson Winsett, Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. Can we also talk about, and maybe this is also with CPOST as well, really who this report will go to? I can see this being possibly being some sensitive information, especially when you're truly attaching names to accusations, possibly accusations, complaints. It could get a little, a little dicey. So as far as kind of who it would be distributed to, how often, I think that would also help as well.
This is Dr. Portillo, co-chair. I believe that our goal for this was to ensure that officers couldn't move from organization to organization. And right now there is some HR file sharing from organizations, but that may not be fully inclusive, and organizations may need to know to ask for HR files. So I think this list was meant to be used in HR decision-making by jurisdictions. Commissioner McCormick, I think I heard that you were trying to get in as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually wanting to speak in support of something that you just said, Co-Chair Portillo. I like the idea of leaving use of force complaints broad. There's a case unfolding now in Topeka where a police officer broke a young teenager's wrist. Someone called the police on him because he was riding a bike and had a dog. And this was someone who was on the autism spectrum. And the auditor there found that the police officer acted reasonably. I think until there are some significant changes, we need to leave these use of force complaints broad because there is now bias in the system for when people report them.
This is Dr. Anderson, co-chair. I would suggest for the purpose of this that we table this one because there's still added discussion, and perhaps the CPOST suggestion that Dr. Portillo mentioned with having some added language, and Mr. McCormick and Chief Ramsey, perhaps if the two of you all connect on what you might propose as some suggested language, that would be wonderful for the next meeting. And CPOST can connect first with a draft, and then you'll have something to work from. Is that acceptable, Mr. McCormick and Chief Ramsey?
Indeed.
Yes, thank you.
I believe Dr. Davis is also trying to jump in.
Yeah, Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. I asked a question of Chief Ramsey. Is there uniform policy on what gets you fired? Like is it the same category of firing for everybody, or is it everybody? HR department has their own categories of what gets you fired?
Yeah, it's usually based on some type of misconduct. I think we're right to go the CPOST route because they are the clearinghouse for statewide complaints. So I think that portion is right on here. I think that what we need to narrow down and focus on is what level of complaints, what happens if it's unfounded. I believe CPOST now, if they're taking action, they're posting it to their website. But I believe, as the co-chair suggested, I think the best route to go is have them kind of draft what they're doing now, and then we can work through that after we receive that.
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. And so just to add to Chief Ramsey and Mr. McCormick's wonderful work that they're about to do, I would go beyond just that of complaints of use of force and also look at any substantiations of of violations. Each agency has their own general orders, and there are a lot of general orders that deal with not criminal acts, but acts concerning integrity, acts concerning racial bias, acts concerning a lot of things that never make it outside of that agency, which if the agency substantiates that this officer has been proven to be egregious, racist, and so on and so forth, I do believe that that information should also be a part of whatever statewide list that we're putting out here. And so I agree, it shouldn't simply be allegations, but to reach a substantiation that means that there was some type of investigation to show that this happened. So I'm not saying put it on now, but I'm saying for you wonderful commissioners, when you're talking about this, I don't think we should limit it to simply use of force, because bias and racism absolutely goes beyond just the act of use of force.
And this is Gordon Ramsay. That's a good point, DA. And I think in the review, in that comprehensive review of CPOST that we recommended, maybe that is an area that, as they look at best practices, I would think that would be included to address the issues that you bring up around Brady Giglio and disclosure as well.
This is Commissioner McCormick. I would like to caution us against leaning too much and putting too much faith in CPOST. I feel like they have demonstrated an inability to uncover bias in cases that have been reported. They have done a wonderful job of finding issues in other areas, just not when it comes to bias. So I would caution us against leaning too much and depending too much on their ability to deal with this situation.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Anderson. I'm just going to interrupt for just a moment just to pinpoint the time, and there's been a slight adjustment to the schedule that was shared in that we have another speaker that will start at 4:30. Since we did not cover the listening sessions the learning sessions at the last session, and we have those and new ones to cover at this session, I would suggest that as we're tabling that, since it is a personnel item, that goes right into the recruitment and retention personnel items as well. So we talk about perhaps both of those the next time. And then we use maybe more of our time in the next session in a couple of weeks to address immigration and these other areas, since we are going to maintain that November meeting. Dr. Portillo, is that satisfactory to you since it is now 4 o'clock?
Yes.
Okay. As we continue to proceed on, just as a point for all folks to know that the speaker at 4:30 is Attorney General Schmidt, who will be joining us and closing us out. And so from now to 4:30, we have time to listen to our learning sessions. I'll have to apologize and blank out my screen and step away from this particular portion. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Portillo to conclude with the final portion of the meeting. I did have one learning session that I did attend, Dr. Portillo. I think I was the only member at that particular one. If I may just begin and just share a little bit about that particular session. I believe all of the sessions, if you could, Ms. Davis, bring them all up to remind us all about the many sessions we've been to, since we've been to almost 30. Between someone on the commission, there have been approximately 24, 25 sessions thus far. With that, the session, and Ms. Davis, I believe you were at the session that I was at with the various mayors and city managers, and I have to remember which date that was, on October the 20th, that municipal leadership session. And I'll just give a couple of small updates from that particular session, and then step away from the remainder of the meeting. The various mayors that were on that session, they not only shared a little bit about their updates in regards to things that they have done, particularly the Wichita mayor spoke highly of many of the things that they're currently doing, but I want to talk about areas of opportunity and suggestions. Given that many have, depending on the size of the area, have a variety of initiatives in diversity and inclusion, The items that they mentioned that they've added body cameras, and some have added citizen review boards. But the suggestions that I noted from several individuals included adjustments in having a statewide system for performance records, which is really what we're talking about now, and perhaps those performance records being passed along to other municipalities for those HR departments. So you would know who is terminated from one department to the next. They also suggested they really wanted more qualitative data to be taken about experiences, such as interviews and interactions. They felt like some of the data collection that we're talking about as we talk about data collection, if it could be more than just numbers and some level of qualitative kind of experiential data or community interviews that we might include in our recommendation. The other item, as we talk about recruitment, overall, keeping in mind the recruitment of female officers in some fashion. They have found from data, some of them referenced that de-escalating has been something that they've seen as an area of strength when there's broader diversity in gender in particular. There were some other items mentioned, but I will stop there in the interest of time and turn it over to the co-chair to continue on the meeting.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. So there were 2 meetings with municipal leaders. I know one of the others I attended, and I know a few others were there as well. Do we want to wrap up discussions of the municipal leadership learning sessions before moving on to the other learning sessions that we've had over the past 4 weeks? I would say one of the big takeaways that we had from the municipal leadership learning session that I was on is the discussion that we also heard reiterated from the governor's grants office today, and just kind of the disparity in resources from some of the smaller communities versus larger communities, and disparity in resources thinking about reporting and diversification of police departments and oversight within police departments. There was also a pretty significant push for expanded mental health care and a goal of seeing Medicaid expanded as a way to offset costs for mental health care, particularly with incarcerated populations in local jails. But we'll go back to some of the earlier listening sessions that we've had since our last meeting. There were, I guess this is going all the way back to the beginning of October at this point. So we had a training academy in history of policing learning sessions. Would anyone like to report on the non-KLETC Academies learning session? The learning sessions are recorded and posted on our website. So if we don't have any large takeaways, then we can ask folks who are watching this that if they'd like to hear more about those learning sessions, they can visit our website on the governor's website and watch the recording. The history of policing, this was with Professor Walker, a discussion of the history of policing. Are there commissioners who would like to share from that learning session?
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. I was a part of the history on policing. The professor gave quite a bit of history and details concerning the beginning of policing in this country, both how it was established and definitely the good aspects of it and the desires for it, but also how it was indeed tainted by the racist history and slavery. But it also talked about how there was a lack of funding, specifically throughout the country in this specific area. I found his presentation to be very insightful. I really wanted a little bit more of the beginning stages of policing here in our country. I felt that was just a tad bit lagging or lacking, but he did give quite a bit of information, and he is, and I believe Chief Ramsey can even talk more about this, one of the leading professors concerning law enforcement and its history and things of that sort as a civilian. He did speak about and I don't have my notes right in front of me, but he spoke about the 3 different ways that you can have community oversight concerning an agency, and what he believed to be the best route to take, and how the community could be involved. And so I would absolutely encourage us to, as we continue to move forward, check out the links that he sent us in concern of how other states have done it.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. Thank you, Commissioner Dupree. I think that our discussion of accountability in 2 weeks would probably benefit from some discussions around different oversight models. Chief Ramsey, did you want to add anything?
Thank you. This is Gordon Ramsey. I found his presentation enlightening as well, and particularly what really boiled down to a recommendation for the best practice for accountability. His views on how they had evolved over citizen review, civilian review oversight, and that his recommendation today seemed to be that the auditor model of monitoring complaints and internal issues in the police department really was what he considered a best practice. And I found that very helpful.
This is John Ney with the Kansas AFL-CIO. I also sat in on that session, and he talked about that very thing that Chief Ramsey is talking about. But there was also a caveat to that. There was kind of a hybrid model, if I'm not mistaken. But he also talked about the Colorado, what the state of Colorado has put together, one of the top models in the country. And that this could be something that we could look at down in the future and just get ourselves more educated on that model that they presented in the state of Colorado, if I'm not mistaken. But I enjoyed it as well. It was very informative, and that's something that we could all, look at. From my end, that's what I liked about it.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. So I would ask us to all take a look at the links that Professor Walker provided, and I'll ask Kate and Kyle from the governor's office to please include those in our weekly email next Wednesday, so we all have a chance to review those before our discussion of accountability in 2 weeks. Thank you. I do want to make sure that we keep moving so we can get through all of these listening sessions, because we had quite a few of them. There was a listening session on the co-responders programs. We heard from quite a few different co-responder programs throughout the state, down in Wichita and Topeka, and then Overland Park as well. I know I was a part of that session. It was great to learn about the co-responder programs that are going on. Again, one of the big discussions here was thinking about funding and an expansion of mental health funding throughout the state, since many of these co-responder programs are really focused on mental health responses. There was also an interesting discussion about the different ways in which these were structured. So some of them are partnering with nonprofit organizations locally, and some of them are bringing on folks within the police department. And then there are some communities who've been having discussions about co-responder programs with fire and medical, EMT, rather than thinking about this in police departments. So were there others who wanted to report on co-responder programs? Okay, we will continue to move on to the Center.
Yeah, this is John Ned, Kansas AFL-CIO. I sat in on that session as well, and I just kind of found some of the notes. It's going to be a collaborative effort, like you said, partnerships within all the communities, especially like Topeka, Wichita, Kansas City. They partnered with and found money somehow through the cities. Like for example, the city of Topeka partnered with various other agencies and created some positions, and then the city of Topeka added more funding to the budget to keep those positions and lock in more. So I thought that was very good about here in the city of Topeka, and I think in Wichita has a good program down there as well. I'm hoping that as we learn and move forward, that more and more agencies will look at this co-partnership and grow it, because it really takes a lot of load off of those officers that are out in the streets and dealing with issues they have not enough training on, and create those positions that we can get more responsive to the needs of those dealing with mental illness.
Thank you, Commissioner Nave. So we'll move on to the Center for Policing Equity. Here we heard from the Center for Policing Equity presenting on a project that they did with the state of California as they were implementing a new data collection practice, and particularly around stop data. So how agencies provided stop data to the state. And so this was, I referenced earlier when we were hearing from the Governor's Grants Office, this was funding that went from the Attorney General's office in the state of California to really make more uniform how agencies were reporting stop data throughout the state. So they were reporting on some of the research that they participated in there. Do you have any other feedback from the Center for Policing Equity learning session?
This is Commissioner Anthony Lewis, Lawrence Public Schools. I found this one to be very interesting from a standpoint of the data collection. There were 5 major categories that they talked about in terms of where they capture this data. Obviously, just basic information, the officer making the stop, the person being stopped, and the details, location, and then of course the actions. But they also talked about in this report the decision to stop. So at that point, what is the officer's decision to stop a vehicle? Some may think, well, he or she ran a stoplight, or may have had a major traffic violation. But I was really interested in collecting some data from some other characteristics, I guess vehicle characteristics, that I think will inform some police departments in terms of the vehicles that are chosen to be stopped. I.e., is it I use the example of a lowrider, or is it a car with tinted windows, or is it so other characteristics that I think will provide some heavy insight to behaviors or patterns of vehicles that are being stopped.
This is Co-Chair Portillo. A big piece of this discussion was just that asking officers to document their reasoning went a long way in making sure that we could not only track behavior, but it also may create behavioral changes. Because when folks have to put a reason down for why they stopped, that may give pause and create a behavioral change. The University of Kansas learning session, this was where we heard from students who are currently in higher education and hearing about their experiences. So students were presenting a bit about a task force that is currently taking place at the University of Kansas about their public safety office, but then also spent some time talking about youth engagement with police officers. There was quite a bit of discussion and frustration with student resource officers in schools, and some kind of lived experiences that students presented around negative impacts of police officers in schools. Would anyone else like to report details from University of Kansas learning session if you're also present?
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. I was part of that listening session. I was, impressed by all of the students. It was definitely a diverse group of individuals. One of the things that stuck out to me was, beyond their learned experiences, was that they have multiple initiatives happening on the campus, and that has been happening since the George Floyd incident, and if not before, to try to really bring about some type of reform with policing there on the campus. As we all know, they have their own policing agency there, and working with the city of Lawrence and the city of Lawrence's council or commissioners there. And so they brought a lot to the table. One of the things that they did say, having reached out to multiple organizations there, and some of them couldn't make it, was that they're tired. They're tired of having to carry the water on these issues. And so I think it's good that the young people are involved and they're trying to do something, but it also, touched me that, we have to do something because they can only carry it so far while still in school and trying to get their education.
This is Deangela Burns Wallace, Secretary of Administration for the state of Kansas. I also joined the KU conversation, and I would echo what both of you shared from that conversation. The other thing that I would just add, one of the things that I also heard, I think, from the students was even with the conversations that were going on, there were still pockets where they felt that there was a lack of transparency in terms of, what were the policies and procedures that, particularly in the public safety space, they felt like when they went to go look at, the governance, the policies, things that to understand, what was going on and what were the driving forces and accountability with the city of Lawrence police, that they could find that information, right? But they didn't feel like they had that same level of transparency or understanding with their campus public safety. And again, for some of them, as they were asking questions, it wasn't even about like it's a problem or there's an issue, as much as just wanting to know, like, what are those policies? And so when there's a question or when there's a stop, or who do you talk to, or what does that chain of command look like? And so whether it's perceived or not, the perception of the students is just that transparency wasn't there, and they felt that they could get more answers and more information from the city of Lawrence than they felt that they were getting from their own public safety. And that just kind of echoed through when they were asking questions about accountability and transparency. And that came through, I think, just really strong in their comments and conversation.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. Thank you, commissioners. We also had a learning session on qualified immunity with Professor Schwartz. She provided a lot of very detailed information and pointed to some model legislation out of Colorado that looked at how qualified immunity might shift. She provided us with quite a few links and articles. It was really some great homework. I loved nerding out on it. I know there were quite a few other commissioners who were a part of that learning session. Would anyone else like to report out?
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. I was very impressed by the professor, and again here there was quite a few links that she was able to give us. Looking at what this professor indicated to us and really kind of educated us concerning qualified immunity, and comparing it to what Professor Sam Walker with the history on policing. One thing that I found interesting was that both of them said that there wasn't a lot of change in our country's policing up until the 70s and 80s. It wasn't until after the 60s and all of the riots, and in the 70s, where police began to really be held accountable for some of their actions. And it wasn't until 1980, I can't remember the exact year that she talked about, but an African American man and his family was abused and beat by an officer. And that was one of the first cases that really brought about case law to hold policing and government officials accountable for their acts that violated one's constitutional rights. And that birthed quite a bit of the qualified immunity and so on and so forth. But since then, there really hasn't been any positive change. In fact, her argument was that it's moved against what it was originally for, and it's really covering. And so I really like what she said. I would encourage everyone to review a lot of her work that she has put out there concerning qualified immunity moving forward.
Thank you, Commissioner Dupree. And we do have some of the links that are shared on in part of our Google Drive and some of our learning documents. I would encourage those commissioners who are interested to take a look at that Colorado legislation around qualified immunity reform. One of the this is a big discussion that's happening with a lot of folks who are part of the law enforcement profession, of holding up qualified immunity as a potential, if getting rid of qualified immunity may do away with people being interested in the profession of law enforcement. And a big part of what Professor Schwartz was pointing out is that officers are still personally protected because when these lawsuits happen, they're often going after liability of the municipalities and the organizations that they're working for. And so this is really a discussion around how do we modernize discussions of law enforcement. We also had a presentation from the ACLU. Commissioner McCormick was there, and ACLU presented a really great presentation around some potential reforms, and they also gave us some great information on updates that we might want to consider as a commission. Commissioner McCormick, would you like to report out on this learning session?
Thank you. This is Commissioner McCormick. It was probably great because I spoke very little, but I thought that my work family did a good job of talking about some of the things that have surfaced in other conversations that we've had with other presentations, like the need for data transparency. We have talked in the past about probation and parole fines and fees and needing some adjustments there so that we're not continuing to punish poverty. One of the high points for me in terms of my involvement, it had to do with our clemency project. We are filing clemency applications that fast track those applications to the governor's desk. And we're up to about 70 of those at this point. And lastly, we touched very briefly on an immigration program we're calling Home is Here, where we're calling for local police departments to not comply or not partner with ICE. We call it ICE non-compliance. We've had this discussion in the past, but we feel like local law enforcement partnering with ICE is a duplication of services. It's local police departments spending resources that the federal government should be spending resources on.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Were there any other commissioners who were at the ACLU session that would like to report out or share any information? I will just note that we had talked about our immigration recommendations, and while we still have one immigration recommendation in the yellow portion of our report, we have said that we'll circle back to that. I think that was on our plan for this week. It looks like we'll do that at our next session, but there is some updated language in the draft report, so we just want to make sure that all the commissioners are comfortable with that language or ready for a conversation about how we want that language updated in the report, so we can move our recommendations around the immigration section from yellow to green in the coming weeks as we finish wrapping up our report. So as we think about timelines, I believe those were all of the sessions that we've had so far in the month of October, because we started our discussion with the municipal leadership, both of our municipal leadership learning sessions. We have 4 learning sessions that are scheduled. 3 of these have to do with juvenile justice and school resource officers. So the first is a session that's coming up next week with Professor Aaron Kupchak, who's a national leader on SRO research. So this is kind of the academic side of what do we know from the evidence around school resource officers, and that will be next Thursday. And then we have a discussion around juvenile justice and racial disparities. That will be the following Monday. And then Kansas Juvenile Officers Association, and that will be practitioners who work as SROs. And then hopefully we have a tentative session planned with the Fraternal Order of Policing. So this is the police union. That will be our 25th and final learning session. So I just want to say a huge thank you to all of the commissioners for all of the work and time that you've put into these, because we did just start this a few short months ago this summer, and in around 4 months, we'll have completed 25 learning sessions throughout the state. So thank you for all of the time that you've put into that. Are there any other discussions or local updates that commissioners would like to share from their local communities? We have about 5 minutes before Attorney General Schmidt joins our commission for a final presentation for the evening. If there are no other commissioners who have updates, I will just share that this is co-chair Shannon Portillo again, I've been serving on the subcommittee on race on the Legislative Commission on Criminal Justice Reform. And so we are working on a report. Commissioner McCormick is vice chair of that subcommittee as well. So we've been working on a report that will be included as part of the Commission on Criminal Justice Reform through the Kansas legislature. And our goal out of the subcommittee is really to ask for a broader committee to look at these issues from a legislative perspective, specifically around racial equity and criminal justice, but also pointing to the work of this commission, in particular, the work of this commission and some of the recommendations that we are making, and the work of the Pretrial Justice Reform Commission, which we heard from Judge Carol Arnold Berger about, and her report that is also recently just been released. So we will, instead of creating a whole new list of recommendations for that subcommittee, we decided to point to some of the other work that's being done across the state, and also note that this is an ongoing area where we may want to see a permanent commission established by the legislature to work through issues of racial equity and justice.
Hi,
This is John. Go ahead.
Go ahead,
This
John.
is John Nate. Go ahead.
But we'll go with Mr. Jordan and then Mr. Nave. Please, Mr. Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you. David Jordan, United Methodist Health Ministry Fund. Just in light of that update, I just wanted to share that I know that given the focus on behavioral health and mental health needs and the interactions with the law enforcement and criminal justice system, and that will have some recommendations on this. I had a discussion with the folks at the Kansas Health Institute, and they're supporting interim legislative committee on mental health modernization, and they're working on a number of recommendations and items that have been discussed as part of our work group around issues like co-responders, mobile crisis units, and other items. So I think there'll be some alignment there, which I thought was exciting. So I know that will be future discussion, but it could match up well with legislative priorities as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Commissioner Nave?
Yeah, this is John Nate, Kansas FLCIO. One of the, I do see in one of our listening, this close to our last listening session with the FOP, and I know their concerns is they're wanting just 5 to 6 commissioners at this listening session. I challenge that because I want them to know that they will not get bombarded with a lot of aggressive questions. I think that, we as a commission and been conducting these listening sessions for weeks now, and we are in a place to where we're wanting to engage with good conversation. But I think with just having 5 to 6 commissioners is troubling to me. Whether, because we know the dynamics. I do, coming from a labor union position. But I just want, to rest assured that if we can have more commissioners or solicit some good questions to the FOP that they can answer. So that's my opinion. And it would show that we are just wanting to know from their perspective. That helps us formulate a good outcome in this whole program.
Thank you, Commissioner Nave. I will note that the FOP has asked for questions in advance, so all of the commissioners are welcome to provide questions, and Ms. Davis will collect those for us so we can make sure that we can get questions from across the commission. I believe that some of this just had to do with communication, that we had noted that for most of these sessions, we only have between 3 and 5 commissioners. We didn't kind of share that there are a few of these sessions that go to our cap of less than half the commission. So we will hopefully be able to record that session as we have with the others, but I do encourage everyone to share questions in advance of that session.
This is Judge Centeno in Sedgwick County. I'm just wondering, has the commissioners that are going to attend that, have they already been chosen, or have they already been registered, or are there open slots?
There are still open slots. So that was one that we just finalized the date for that. So if there are commissioners who would like to go to that session, if they would please email Ms. Davis.
This is Mark. I'm sorry, Kate, I seen you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to, this is Kate Davis from the governor's office. I was just going to say that was listed in the weekly update email that you should have received last night. And I'm just doing first come, first serve. So I think I've had 3 respond already who say they want to be there. So rush and get your email to me if you want to be included, but also please send questions. And I think we can continue a dialogue with that group through the rest of the work of the commission.
So I'm going to send you an email, but please put my name down, Kate, for that, because I don't type as fast as some of my other commissioners here. But I will say this, kind of in line with Commissioner Nave, we have done a great job in having open conversation and being respectful, and really trying to understand all sides of this. Okay. But I want to make sure that we are not looking past the fact that the FOP has played historically a huge role in many of the disparities in the complaints that we are now talking about. And they, meaning the FOP and their leadership, know this. And I think it's quite frankly, I've never been chosen because of me being bashful. But I think it's a little lopsided for them to really say to us they don't want to have a certain amount of people there and they need all these questions up front. The whole purpose of the governor putting this task force or commission together is to get to the root of the issue so we can stop having conversation and actually do something about the issue. And if they're afraid to have the doggone conversation and acknowledge that a situation is a problem, then I don't know what's the point of us talking to them when their mind is already made up that I'm going to have something written out to give them. Now, I know this is not going to get me on the side of every FOP, but here's the point. Point is there are racial inequities in this state, and in order for us to really bring about change and togetherness with Black and brown and broke folks in this state with law enforcement, the FOP have to be willing to deal with real conversation and real issues without wearing their emotions on their sleeve. And I'm saying this as a Black man. If I can have these tough conversations without wearing my emotions on the sleeve, then the FOP need to learn to do the same.
And this is Jackson Winston with the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. And Mark, I commend you, sir, even though I know you're bashful. You stated that very well. I noticed that the date for that FOP listening session, it's on Veterans Day. And I want to make sure that I know this has been a very in-demand listening session. I want to try and keep from it being rescheduled again or even canceled, which would be even worse. So if we could get a confirmation on that date, that would help. And I think traditionally the listening sessions I've attended, they've been roughly about an hour, maybe just a little bit more, just kind of depending on conversation. Kind of more in line with what Commissioner Dupree was mentioning. This organization is in demand for a lot of questions and answers. If we could extend that time, I think it would also be helpful as well.
Yeah, so this is Kate Davis with the governor's office. I think in that email, there was a note that I was going to confirm the date because it was Veterans Day.
Okay.
And also that we hadn't actually confirmed the time. they had said that evening. So there's a lot about that I wanted to get it to everyone because I wanted everyone to know that we're having the conversation about setting another time, but there are a few things that are tentative about it. So I will just say that whenever I talk to anybody who I'm talking to about a listening session or a learning session, I tell them it's usually about an hour. It's usually 3 to 5 commissioners. And I think that, you know, there's been a lot of conversation, and they requested that we stick with those initial kind of expectations that were set.
One question, I'm sorry, Jackson Winsett, Kansas City Federal Reserve. Kate, are there concerns from the FOP with adding more commissioners to this session?
They requested that we keep it with that initial expectation.
This is Judge Centeno in Sedgwick County. I'm wondering, it almost sounds like an ultimatum, as if they're telling us that they're not going to participate if we expand how many commissioners appear. Is that so, Kate, or am I reading too much into that?
They have requested that we stick with what those original expectations were that were set.
This is Commissioner McCormick. I would have to agree with District Attorney Dupree. Their concern about answering some tough questions really concerns me.
There we go.
People doing public work ought to be able to weather tough questions. We have been very civil, but we have asked tough questions. If they're unable to answer.
Mr. McCormick, I do appreciate the focus on tough questions and the focus on kind of being open to hearing from lots of folks. So it sounds like we have a lot of conversation around the FOP. I would suggest that we send those questions and comments to Ms. Davis. Right now, we do have Attorney General Schmidt with us. And so I'd like to make sure that we can reserve the last bit of our meeting to hear from the Attorney General and to hopefully ask him some questions as well. So we'll hear a short presentation and then open it up to question and answer. So thank you for being with us this afternoon, Attorney General Schmidt.
You're welcome. I'm sorry we're a few minutes late. We had, we're 7 months into this pandemic and we haven't quite mastered our online video conferencing yet, but we're making progress. Shannon, I appreciate the invitation. I'm not entirely certain what you all were interested in, so I'd take a little guidance. I would presume that you invited me here to talk a bit about the racial and bias-based policing statute and the role that we play in it. But if I'm mistaken on that, please let me know so I can cover what you're interested in.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. I appreciate that. That is exactly what we've asked you here for, just to kind of tell us a bit about your role with that piece of legislation, as well as if you have recommendations for the committee on how we might think more broadly about the state implementing policies and practices to move us towards racial justice. And then if you would at least reserve some of the time for questions and answers from the commission, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely, will do. I'm here with our division head, Athena Andea, who, as soon as I get in, beyond my general knowledge, can fill in any particulars that the commission may have. So we have, as you know, in Kansas, the modern version of the racial and other bias-based policing statute has been on the books since 2011. There was a statute prior to that, but 2011 was really I'd characterize it as a fairly significant overhaul of the statute. It was my first year serving in this office, so we have lived on our watch, we've lived under the current version and really only the current version. I think the effective date may have been in 2012, but 2011, I think, was the legislative action. I know it was the legislative debate, maybe it occurred the next session. The statute as it's currently written gives us a somewhat cramped role, and I say that to describe I hope accurately what our role is, not to characterize whether it ought to be something more or less. Our role is to receive complaints, folks who are aggrieved by policing conduct that they believe may violate the statute may file a complaint with us or with the local agency that is involved. If they file with us, the statute provides essentially a screening role for us, which is what we perform. If we approach it as if almost like a well-pleaded complaint rule or almost a motion to dismiss, if you want to analogize it to litigation. If the complaint alleges something or colorably could allege something that, if true, would be a violation of the statute, then our role is to send it on to the Commission on Peace Officer Standard and Training, CPOST, which of course is the licensing agency for every sworn officer in Kansas and has the actual authority to take some type of enforcement action in the event that an officer violates the statute. I think the reason the statute was written that way, and I'm now going to share with you only what I know from my memory. I wasn't obviously in the legislature when it was passed, but we were watching it because we recognized it was going to affect this office. My recollection is that obviously CPOST is the licensing agency that has actual authority to investigate, including with compulsory process if necessary, allegations of the violation of licensing standards for officers, including violations of the requirements of the racial and other bias-based policing statute, and to take a license action if appropriate, if warranted by the evidence. We don't have any of that at the AG's office. There was, at least from my vantage point, there appeared to be some disagreement in the legislature back in 2011 about whether CPOST was a sufficient enforcer of those requirements. And there were different points of view among legislators. There was legislation that was originally proposed that year, had nothing to do with the Attorney General's office. It proposed to have the Kansas Human Rights Commission perform essentially the role that we now perform in terms of being another place where person aggrieved can file a complaint and have it considered in some manner. There was disagreement on that, and as I say, I wasn't in the room, but ultimately I recall my phone ringing, and the ask to us was, would we be willing to perform that role? Apparently, at that point, we were viewed as a reasonable compromise among the parties that were focused on that, and of course I said yes. And so the statute was enacted in its current form. As we got into this initially, we had envisioned doing a somewhat robust training component as well. We asked for funding in the first year the statute was enacted to hire a full-time staff person to handle the responsibilities of the racial and bias-based policing statute. For whatever reason, I'm sure it was budgetary, but we didn't get any funding from the legislature. So we did go out in the marketplace and identified, my recollection is it was through KDOT. If that's relevant, I'll double check to be sure that's right. But we identified some grant funds that allowed us, that we applied for and got. And it allowed us to hire a person to oversee the implementation of the statute from our office's standpoint, including not only processing of complaints, but also doing some training work. And we then asked for funding the next, couple of years. I don't recall precisely how many. It wasn't ever appropriated. We were able to keep that grant funding for a handful of years. I think it was 2 or 3, but again, if that's relevant, we can dig that up and let you know. And eventually the grant funding went away. It was never replaced with appropriated funds. And so we were left in the position of having duties, but no money to perform them. Since then, what I've tried to do, and we continue to this day, is sort of piecemeal it, for lack of a better term. We have a couple of staff people who have some experience in the subject matter. We've used them for training requests when we've received them. I just approved one today from a community advisory board that wanted some training, and we're able to make that work. I've also I've got an outside trainer we've started using for some of those requests to try to enhance our capacity. We sort of scraped together the pennies and entered into that agreement. And then with respect to the processing of complaints, once we lost the person who was dedicated to this job overall, I needed to find a home for that. And so I have. We've now embedded it in what we call our Logic Division, Legal Opinions and Government Counsel. Deputy Attorney General Andea heads that division. She has a clerical employee who handles that processing. Again, we're just looking sort of at the face of the complaint, and if it pleads something that, if true, would potentially be a violation, we send it to C-Post for them to fully investigate and take whatever action they think is appropriate. That's really the sort of four corners of our duties under the statute, and it's how we're currently performing them. I'd be glad to take any questions or talk about what might be of interest. Or if I've not quite hit the mark with what you're interested in, let me know, and I'll be glad to do that as well.
This is Co-Chair Dr. Portillo. Thank you for that initial description, and we will open it up to questions. It looks like Commissioner Velarde was on screen for a second. I don't know if that meant.
I was, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
yeah. That was just. Hi, good afternoon, AG Schmidt, Catalina Velarde, member of the commission. I'm looking at your office's annual reports on the racial and bias-based policing. I see that that there's an asterisk on the 2019 and 2020 reports saying that beginning in fiscal year 2019, the OAG is now only reporting complaints that met this pre-screen criteria to be forwarded on to C-Post. Which, so for example, in 2018, seeing 19 total reports to the AG's office, and about 7 or 8 of those were forwarded to C-Post. In 2019 report, same, I see only 7 complaints that were forwarded to C-Post, but we can't see the total number of complaints, and same with 2020. Why was that decision made to only include in the report the complaints that met the pre-screening criteria?
Sure. I'll tell you what I know from my vantage point, and then I'm going to ask Athena if she has anything further she wants to add from the sort of operations standpoint. As any of you who may work with any public entity that receives complaints from the public on any subject, not just this subject matter, it is not uncommon to receive complaints that have nothing to do with the subject matter at hand. We get that, for example, a lot in our consumer protection division, where we get lots of complaints that allege a potential consumer violation, and then we'll get a complaint that alleges that they're unhappy with their mayor about something. I mean, it's just wholly unrelated to the subject matter. The issue that was brought to me by our team when we looked at that change was we were receiving some significant number of complaints that came in through our racial and other bias-based policing intake that had nothing to do with racial and other bias-based policing. And it seemed odd to include those in a report when the subject matter didn't connect. Now, with respect to, so that's how we shrunk the universe, and that's my recollection of the reason for that policy change. Now, I suspect that based on how you framed the question, I haven't gone back and looked at exactly what we're reporting now, but I suspect there may also be an issue of things that alleged but didn't rise to the level of, and I'll ask Athena if I've either omitted some description or misstated anything. Is that accurate?
General, that's accurate.
Yeah. Get you on the screen.
Okay. Hello, I'm Athena Andea, Deputy Attorney General in the Logic Division, and the General has described that correctly. So.
Okay, so when you say that they mentioned, but that they allege, but they don't meet the definition, can you give me an example of something that would be along those lines?
Sure. So, for instance, an individual is complaining that they called the law enforcement because they were having a fight with their spouse. Calling law enforcement to your home does not is not one of the complaints that can be filed under the racial and bias-based policing. So that wouldn't have been counted. Another situation, the other situation that the General was talking about is the person alleges that they were stopped and they had law enforcement contact, but then they alleged some other reason for not race, not not a reason that's under the statute. So it would have been, had it been, for instance, a reason for race. The race was the reason for the stop. Does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
Where I might, add to that, I believe it's accurate, and if they know correctly, if she sees it differently, we're pretty liberal in terms of what we forward to CPOST. If there is any plausible allegation that generally relates to the subject matter of the statute, we're going to send it on to them for an actual review by the licensing authority. So is that accurate?
That's very accurate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, this is Commissioner McCormick from the ACLU of Kansas. Attorney General Smith, to what degree do you think racial bias exists in our system here in the state?
Good to see you, Mark. It's been a while.
Yeah, good to see you too.
We were actually in college together. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Not that long.
It's not the years, it's the miles.
There you go. That's exactly right. And by the way, rock chalk. So it's all good. Mark, obviously it does exist. It exists in human relations. And so it therefore exists in the subset of human relations that include law enforcement interactions with people. I do think that on the whole, at least from my vantage point, I think law enforcement agencies in Kansas and CPOST as the licensing entity take allegations of improper racial bias or even racial bias that may not result in any improper action, but nonetheless is inappropriate, whether it's implicit or explicit. I think they take that quite seriously. And I personally have been impressed with the leadership of particularly some of our larger agency leadership. I know you have the Wichita chief on your commission. That this is on their radar screen. It's not an also ran consideration, and I give them credit for that.
One quick follow-up. Do you have a position on no-knock warrants?
No, I don't. I'm familiar with them, and I've read a great deal about them. Of course, after the Taylor case out of Kentucky, they've been very much in the news. I'm not aware, not saying it's not the case, but I'm not aware of incidents in Kansas where it's become a concerning problem. And if that's the case, I don't have any predisposition for or against them. I have talked with a number of agencies in Kansas, law enforcement agencies that of course would be in a position of executing warrants generally, including any no-knock warrants. And there are quite a lot that they just don't use them. They just, from their vantage point, they're not necessary and not worth the trouble. But having said that, that's not either legally required and it may not be the universal approach. So.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Anthony Lewis with Lawrence Public Schools. Thank you for being here, Attorney General Smith. And I appreciate the question that my fellow Commissioner McCormick asked around the seriousness of bias-based policing. So with, I think it was 266 certificate actions from CPOST, and only 227 of them were revocations, but there were absolutely zero, there were none for bias-based policing. Do you feel that of all of the, and that's been since 2015. So since 2015 to date, do you feel none of them rose to the occasion of where certificate action should be taken?
Well, I don't know quite how to answer that, Dr. Lewis, and here's why. I'm generally cautious about trying to second guess the actions of other agencies unless I have a reason to second guess. I recognize the data point that you just shared, and I didn't know that, but I have no reason to doubt its accuracy. I don't know how to answer that. And perhaps you've already inquired of CPOST about that. If I were going to inquire, I'd want to know why that is. I suppose one possibility is that in more serious cases, those officers' misconduct is either dealt with prior to a CPOST revocation action by the local leadership, for example. But I don't know that. I don't know that.
This is Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. I'm going to ask you, Attorney General, about data collection. So about what data do you collect, and what data do you collect that is mandatory for the police officers, police law enforcement officers to report, and what data, if any, do you collect that is voluntary?
Right. Well, from the AG's office standpoint, we really don't collect any. We don't really have the statutory authority to collect any, other than the requirement that we gather from every law enforcement agency in the state their statutorily required annual reports on racial and bias-based policing, and then we compile that and post it on our website. I think that's what was referenced earlier. Generally, the cooperation from agencies is pretty good. We've sort of stepped that up in recent years. We had a number of agencies that were not reporting as they were required to do, and I think we're actually, I don't know the numbers, but I think we're actually pretty close now to complete compliance. Most of them that weren't complying, our experience was they tended to be small agencies that were going to report zero, and they just thought taking no action was the functional equivalent of reporting zero. And we told them that's not true. You got to file the report that says whatever the number is. Beyond that, which is one of our duties under the statute, we don't have a data collection function, and not just in this space. And we generally are not data collectors, for the state. That obviously, as I'm sure you're well aware, has been a significant public policy issue debated in the legislature repeatedly over the years, including at the time the current statute was adopted in 2011. And again, as I said earlier, we sort of watched that debate from literally across the street, but I'm quite mindful that the debate about data collection was part of it. Ultimately, that statute didn't include much of a mandate other than the reporting piece that I just described for data collection. There have been subsequent efforts over the years in the legislature to add that back in. My own view, and I've said this to legislative committees and to individual legislators on sort of both sides of the collection debate, I think data collection is a good thing on the whole. I think, it's like anything, we've got to be mindful not to ask, cops aren't clerks, and we got to be mindful not to impose data collection obligations on them that have a likelihood of impeding their ability to do their job. But on the whole, I think data collection is good. I actually just asked, it's not squarely on point with racial and bias-based policing, but mindful of sort of the current national discussion on use of force incidents regarding police officers. I just recently asked the KBI to work with law enforcement agencies around the state to give me a recommendation on what a use of force data collection procedure might look like to get us meaningful, usable data on use of force incidents, both by officers and against officers. So you get kind of a total picture of what's going on the street when force is involved. And at the same time is balanced against, the reality you don't want to overburden folks whose principal job is not to collect data. And that's been fairly well received. I wasn't sure how that request would be received by everybody, but so far it's been pretty well received. And I'm hoping by around the end of the year, I'll have whatever recommendation they're going to make, which I intend to share with policymakers or anybody else that wants to see it.
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney.
Hi, Mark.
General, it's always a pleasure. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. How are things in Wyandotte County?
Wyandotte is always great. We're the dot. We stay great. And not to be confused with the other Mark that you went to school with. It is the Miles, but I still wasn't back there during that time. So I'm gonna leave you two alone concerning that. Real quick, the question that I want to ask, you talked about how there was funding at the beginning when this was enacted, and then it kind of went away. As you've seen in our country and in our state, and the questions that are being asked concerning disparities and the issues concerning trust in people of color in our state and country, one, would you be willing to ask again now for more funding to have someone to assist in your office specifically concerning the statute? And two, is there something that you would add that you haven't done to assist in dealing with the race equity issues in our state that maybe a paid employee could assist you with that you haven't been able to kind of piecemeal as you have for the last several years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to ask again. Like I said, we asked for several years, nothing came, and you run a public agency, you eventually sort of you set priorities, right? And sometimes when you get told no several times, you figure out a way around it and you move on to something else. And that's kind of where we've been in terms of the request. But if you think it's beneficial, we'd be glad to ask. I say that obviously our budget's already submitted to DOB, so we'd have to ask in a less direct way. But I'd have no problem with that, I guess, is the bottom line, or if the legislature wanted to add it. I think part of that also would be, Mark, what do you want us, not you, but what do they want us to do with the body? What we were doing initially was standing up the AG office to perform the roles that we've just described, because we went from no direct role to the things we've just described. We were doing training, and I think that's an area we could probably, I'd like to do more. I mean, but for not having, the money to hire the person to do that on if not a full-time basis, at least a more full-time basis. I think that's an area where we could and should do more. In terms of the clerical piece of it, I actually think the current system's working reasonably well in terms of intaking, processing, and forwarding the complaints, which is what the statute contemplates. So, I guess having now said all that out loud, I'd probably, yes, I'd welcome the funding. And my recommendation would be that it be used to beef up our ability to provide training upon the request of agencies, community groups, et cetera. We were doing more of that early when we did have that grant funding available.
Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. Attorney General, we've been looking at this model from North Carolina where all law enforcement officers have to fill out a form when they pull someone over to suggest, to record why they pulled them over, what happened after they pulled. Did they search them? Was it probable cause? Was it consent? Did they find contraband? How much contraband? So it's this form that fills out. The system in North Carolina works is that they fill the form out digitally and it's sent to the AG's office, and the AG compiles that information. Now, I guess I'm not, what I want to know is it possible, because I can't really get the interworkings of how that works from the AG's office. Is it possible that someone in your the department you were talking about could get information on the inner workings of that, and we can see if that could be something possible that could be implemented here in Kansas? Because the information is not readily available on the North Carolina AG's site, and it's but it's a system whereas all that information is compiled and kept in the AG's office, and it's digital, so it wouldn't take it's not as difficult to manage as would be like paper or something.
Sure. So just so I understand, is the request, could we contact North Carolina AG's office and see if we can get some more information that we then share with the commission on basically how that works in North Carolina and what their role is? Is that what we're looking for?
Yeah, because if something like that will be implemented, I'm assuming it'll be implemented in the same area as where you're collecting the data on the use of force. And so if it's possible for someone in that area to see, or to be able to contact them to get some more information that we can't get, that I can't get from Googling on how that works, would be much appreciated. I don't know if that's a feasibility, but if that's possible, that would be much appreciated.
Sure. We know folks in the North Carolina AG's office. We'll contact them and just ask them what they've got and see if we can get some info. And if we're successful, and I assume we will be, we'll be glad to relay that to the commission.
That would be.
I will tell you, and I'm not arguing the point either way. I'm just trying to share information that might be helpful. The idea of digital collection, it's not new, of course, in the discussion about whether additional data collection should be mandated. It was, as I recall, part of the discussion in 2011, and I'm quick to say that was 9 years ago, and so things have changed. I got that. But I do recall, one piece of the discussion, you might characterize it as some of the pushback to that. At least back then, there were still a significant number of law enforcement agencies in the state that odd as it sounds, didn't really have ready digital data collection capacity. Maybe they do 9 years in, but that was a reality in 2011, and it was a reality that the legislature ultimately, I assume, factored into the decision they made not to mandate. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be required. I'm just saying I think that's an issue you will run into if you go down that path, and so you might want to be mindful of it. There's sort of an interesting data point that I share sometimes, and I may be a little off on my numbers because I haven't double checked them for a few years, but I'm in the ballpark. There are something like 400 law enforcement agencies in Kansas, give or take. And out of those 400, something like 2/3 of them have 5 or fewer sworn officers. And something like nearly 3/4 of them, I'm not sure, maybe 70%, north of 2/3, have 10 or fewer sworn officers. So it's not an excuse. And I know everybody's got a cell phone now. So I'm not saying it's an inherent barrier. I'm just saying that dynamic is real, and but it may also be real in North Carolina. We'll see what we can find out and share it.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. I do just want to be mindful of time because we're a bit past 5 o'clock, which is when we traditionally kind of close down. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time here. I do want to thank the Attorney General for speaking with us, and thank you even more for reaching out to North Carolina. I know that feasibility has been a big piece of some of these things. We also have heard from researchers in the state of California that send digital data through the Attorney General's office, and their feasibility, because of the number of rural departments in that state and the big disparities in large and small departments. These are problems that states have considered and overcome. So I think it would be interesting for our commission to hear more about what some of those options might be. And we really appreciate your cooperation in helping us find that information where we can. I just want to thank you again for visiting with us, and thank you, commissioners. We will reconvene in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Take care. We'll be in touch with what we find out in North Carolina.
Thank you, Sergeant. Thank you.
Bye.
Be blessed, everyone.